Hubert, great to connect today. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Nate, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
I'm wondering if you could share an experience you've had where you learned something about leadership that you would most want to pass on to others.
Yeah, Nate, perhaps what stands out is my experience when I was CEO of Best Buy. So, because this was such a delightfully surprising story, this turnaround, but such a great learning opportunity. So perhaps I should paint the picture. So it's 2012. And at the time, everybody thinks that Best Buy is going to die, right? Remember, Best Buy had been a great company, but Amazon was going to kill the company. I get recruited from the outside to be the CEO. And the big message I was getting from a lot of the investors and analysts and so forth was cut, cut, cut. You know, the usual recipe in turnarounds: fire a lot of people, close stores. I say, okay, let's look, right? Well, all of the stores were profitable. So closing stores was not going to be a great, great approach.
Yeah.
And firing a lot of people implied that people were the source of the problem, whereas I thought that people would be the source of the solution.
Hmm.
So what has been certainly fascinating for me in this Best Buy journey is that we've been able to turn around the company through a very human-centric approach, right? There's a chapter in the book I wrote, which is how to turn around the business without everybody hating you. Now, every company on the planet says people is the most important thing, but what does that really mean? And one of the things I've learned is that, you know, the what of the turnaround strategy is interesting, but the how is more interesting. The what is, you know, we match Amazon prices, we invest in the customer experience with the partnerships with all of the tech companies, you know, and. But the how was more interesting. So what does that mean to have a human-centric approach? First lesson was start with people, in particular on the front line. Nate, I spent my first week on the job as a CEO working in a store in St. Cloud, Minnesota, with a badge CEO in training. And I would ask the frontliners, what's working, what's not working, what do you need? Nate, they had all of the answers. My job was super easy. Show up in the store, ask these questions, take notes, and then do as I was told to do with a good say-do ratio, which is such an important other leadership lesson, right? So start with people on the front line. Start with people at the top. I'm a big Maoist, right? So I believe that fish rot from the head. So we placed a big part of the senior management team right up front with the view that in a turnaround, that's another leadership lesson, you never fire somebody too quickly. It sounds very harsh, but that's the truth, because the people who drove the car in the ditch, probably, not all of them can get it out of the ditch. The other part of the people centricity is to end with people, start with people, end with people, meaning consider headcount reduction not as the most important thing you do, but as a last resort. So first focus on growing the top line. It's amazing what revenue growth can do. We did cut costs, about $2 billion of costs were taken out, but 70% of the cost reduction, Nate, was not related to people. If you look at the cost structure of most companies, the vast majority of the cost structure is not people related. So as an example, at Best Buy, we sell a lot of TVs. They're large, they're thin, so they break. We would break for about $200 million worth of TVs every year.
Wow.
And guess what? We've done a customer survey. 0% of customers want to buy a broken TV. And so if you can reduce the 200 million by 50% by working with the vendors, the supply chain, the customers, it's a wonderful thing. We did take some headcount out, but it was a last resort. The leadership lesson is that if you do this, it changes the mindset of the company. And the frontliners in particular felt safe. And then the last element of the people-centric approach during that first phase was, so in physics, we learned that you cannot create energy, right? Unfortunately. But if a company is a human organization made of individuals working together, of course you can create energy. And the CEO is the chief energizing officer. Let's not be confused. And how do you create energy? By co-creating the diagnosis, co-creating the plan, getting going, celebrating the early wins. If something is not working, then you just say it and you rework it and you ask for help. So the first 3 or 4 years of our journey there was this human-centered turnaround plan that led us to save the company and put it in a position to grow. So that was a big lesson.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as I think back to this time and maybe just a little bit before, but the giant electronics store Circuit City was one of my favorites. And I used to
Yeah,
love Circuit City, and it just seemed
yeah,
like overnight it was gone. And
that's right.
it could have been easy. I think the easy prediction was Best Buy is going to be the same.
That's right. There was zero buy recommendation on the stock when I joined. Everybody thought the company was going to die, and so this was this counterintuitive approach that shows that in business, there's something I had learned from the clients. I was starting my career at McKinsey and Company, and I remember, Nate, a dinner with one of our clients. And of course, we were trying to sell him a study, but instead he taught us a lesson. He had just gone through to a workshop with other CEOs. And this was the early 90s. And he came to us and said, this is what we've discussed. He said, the purpose of a company is not to make money. Purpose of a company, it's an imperative. Of course, you need to make money. It's a result, but you shouldn't confuse imperative and purpose. And he said in business, there's three imperatives, right? We know this, right? It's the people imperative. You need to have the right team, properly equipped and motivated. You have the business imperative. You need to have customers who love your products or services. And then you have the financial imperative. And the biggest lesson he taught me, which I've applied ever since, is that number one, you should not accept any trade-offs between people, business, and finance. You should simultaneously optimize. You should treat them in that order: people, business, finance. It says very concretely, and that's maybe the biggest thing that has helped me throughout my career. When you do a business performance management meeting, he says, don't start with finance. You're going to spend your entire meeting dissecting the numbers, and you won't learn anything. Start with people and organization, then go to business, and finish with finance.
Interesting.
And he said, as relates to the purpose, probably the purpose has to do with serving others, the fulfillment of people. But this people, business, finance approach, I think is a game changer, Nate.
Yeah, I think these are really simple frameworks that are quite profound and that you were able to apply. So,
Yeah,
you're trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? I'm a CEO in training. Well, what's working, what's not, and what do you need from me? What a
that's right.
great simple framework
Yeah,
that no doubt leads to all sorts of insights. And then this people, business, finance.
yeah,
Yeah, if I show up to a meeting and there is no focus on people first, I know where I fit in. I know, it's like I know what my value is, but this simple framework is such a great way to approach meetings, companies, organizations.
and a big lesson. So, ironically, when I became CEO of Best Buy, Nate, I had zero retail experience. I had experience with turnarounds and transformation, but zero retail experience. That gave me a huge advantage. There was no way, as the new CEO, I could come in and say, this is what we're going to do.
Mm,
And so this forced me to listen to the frontliners and the other team members. And my job was not to be the smartest person in the room and tell everybody what to do, but to create an environment where together we could co-create, a future that did not exist at the time, but that ended up being great. So that's another leadership lesson. And Satya Nadella beautifully talks about it, right? We need to move from being the know-it-alls as leaders to the learn-it-alls and have that constant curiosity that helps us come up with better answers, frankly.
I love that phrase, be a learn-it-all, not a know-it-all. I interviewed Brad Smith on the
Yeah,
podcast years ago, and
yeah,
that was one
just
of his
wonderful.
favorite phrases. You
Yeah.
mentioned that you were uh, creating energy. Any specific examples of something you did that you felt like created energy?
I mentioned some of them like listening and co-creating, but I'll mention another one because it moves us, in a sense, to the second phase in the turnaround. So it may be 2016. So for 3 or 4 years, we've focused on fixing what was broken. We've stabilized the business. The share price has gone from $11 to maybe $45. Um, but of course, we then move to a question, which is how do we go from turnaround to growth? And how do we reimagine the business? And this was a fascinating second phase. The first phase had a name, it was Renew Blue. The second phase was building the new blue. One of the leadership lessons is you need to give a name to your strategy or your plan, because then it's easier for people to relate to it. And so it started with a dinner of the executive team. Every quarter we would get together as a team to work on our plans, our programs, and what have you, as everybody does. But during one of these offsites, we had asked everybody on the team to come to the offsite with a picture of themselves when they were little, 2 or 3 years old. So as you can imagine, Nate, we got some really cute picture of members of the executive team. And then over dinner, we spent the evening sharing with each other our life story, not our resume, but our real life story, and our purpose in life. Something that is rarely done in business, and I've become a big fan of getting much more personal. And we learned 2 things during that dinner, Nate. One is everybody on the executive team was a human being, complicated, quirky, messy, but beautiful human being. Not just a CFO, not just a CMO, a complicated, beautiful human being. And 2, with a couple of exceptions, everybody on the team shared the same kind of purpose in life. At the highest level is do something good to somebody else, right? Which I believe is in the heart of every human being, including, we always have to quote movies. Even Darth Vader, his son believes the force is still in him, right? So that tells you. And so when we step back and we say, look, we're the leadership team of Best Buy. Why don't we use this platform to create an organization that we would love to work at, that employees would love to work at, that customers would love to do business with, suppliers, communities, investors. And all of a sudden, the work becomes a calling, not just a job. And that led us, Nate, to then articulate our purpose as a company, which is, we're not in the business to be a consumer electronics retailer. We said our purpose is to enrich lives through technology by addressing key human needs. That vastly enlarged our addressable market and the kinds of things we could do. We also work on our strategy. We reshaped our culture in support of that purpose. And we really worked hard to create an environment that allowed 100,000 people, so at scale, to unleash their magic in support of that purpose. And the energy level in that second phase was just extraordinary. So that led me to learn about the power of meaning and purpose, which of course is a huge driver of extraordinary human behavior, the power of empowerment, the power of adopting a growth mindset, which is also something that our friends at Microsoft are passionate about. It taught me about, the difference between purpose and strategy. It also taught me a very interesting lesson, which is the power of culture as an enabler of purpose and strategy. Peter Drucker supposedly said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Nobody knows whether he actually said it, but that sounds great. I have a different view, which is culture is the enabler of strategy and purpose. And while many people think that shaping a culture or changing culture is super hard and takes time, I've actually learned that it's absolutely not the case. You can change a culture quickly. Why? Because if you define a culture around some key behaviors, so this is what I've learned from a McKinsey colleague who then was a board member at Best Buy. If culture is about behaviors, the way you change behaviors is by changing behavior. The way you change behaviors is by changing behavior. And that makes sense, right? Because of role modeling. If the CEO and the management team and the best leaders start behaving in a certain way, and if it's compelling, that needs other people to follow suit. So if we're going to say, we're going to be customer-centric, don't talk about it. Just spend time with customers. And then all of a sudden we become customer-centric. So that second phase was super energizing and fun and growth-oriented, and we all learned a ton during that second phase.
So much insight there. I love the idea and the importance of give a name to the strategy so that people can easily reference
Yeah.
it and know what it means. And then, if finance is number one and business is two and people is three, you're not going to that offsite saying, let's create a company that we would love to work at. It's a totally different experience if the goal is we're going to make money and we're going to try, we're going to extract the most money
Yeah.
possible from every
Uh,
person that walks in that door, right? That's totally different culture than one that says we want to build a store that enhances people's lives and people love to work. Well, you've given me so much to think about, so much great insight. Any final things you'd like to share as we wrap up here?
well, as I think about your students in the world we are in today, there's no doubt that this is a more challenging world than it's been, certainly when I was growing up as an executive and a leader. So that's why investing in our own development is important. But the other thing I would say is that because the world is challenging, the world need, the best possible leaders, and including in the world of business. And so for aspiring and growing leaders, emerging leaders, or mature leaders, uh, the opportunity we get to make a difference in the world is so energizing. There's many things in the world we don't control, and we all know the serenity prayer, right? It's around
Yeah.
making the distinction between what we control and what we don't control. But there's so many things we control, including our own behaviors and including the impact we can have on other people around us. And so for me, that, as I teach at Harvard Business School, that energizes me to want to help this next generation be the best leaders they can be at a time where this is highly needed. And I'm super encouraged, by the way, by the character and the authenticity of the students or the executives I work with. So that makes me very optimistic about the future.
I've been teaching leadership for several years now, and I don't think mentally I've made that connection between the challenges that our world increasingly faces in a new world of AI and how that necessitates the need for more great leaders. And so,
Yeah.
what a great opportunity for us to improve ourselves and try to help others be better leaders. Well, Hubert, I loved it. This was fantastic. I already look forward to listening to this again. So, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you.